This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 603 of the Late Round Podcast, on many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the trends this week, don't forget about the FanDuel NFL High-Low, a free-to-play fantasy football contest. All you have to do is build your scorecard with the teams that you think will score highest or lowest in 4 stat categories, and the closer you are to being spot on, the more points you'll get. Players with the most points each week split the prize pool, and a perfect scorecard will win the jackpot. Head over to FanDuel.com today and play the FanDuel High-Low for free. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Trend 1 this week is about the Rams' backfield. Darrell Henderson was put on IR, so Sony Michel is looking like he's going to see a lot of work once again this week. Cam Akers might actually get some action, but Michel is likely to be a workhorse in Week 17. And he's been acting like that for the last 4 weeks. He's averaged a running back rush share per game of 90% during this time frame, and he's hit a double-digit percentage target share in 2 of those contests. Yes, Darrell Henderson has been out at times, but the reason I want to bring this trend up is because in Week 16, before Henderson got hurt, Michel was dominating touches. Henderson saw his first touch in the 4th quarter. Up until that point, Michel had already touched the ball 18 times. The Rams really transitioned this backfield. And like I've alluded to on this show over the last month, there were small reports saying that this could happen. It's why we've got to pay attention to what beat reporters are saying. Because at the end of the day, running back volume is driven by coaching decisions. You hope the running back is talented, so the coach has no other choice, but coaches are putting these guys on the field, and reporting can help us understand what's in their mind. We're now 16 weeks into this. Our sample sizes aren't massive because football is a small sample size game, but they're not tiny either. And one of the crazier trends this year that hasn't been talked about enough is how pass-heavy the Miami Dolphins have been. On the year, only Buffalo and Tampa Bay have higher pass rates when games are within a 6-point margin, or within neutral game scripts. This is a huge reason Jalen Waddle is doing what he's doing, specifically in PPR formats. They run such a boring offense, partially because of the offensive line, and he's just gobbling up targets close to the line of scrimmage. It's similar to what we've seen with Deontay Johnson. It's not Waddle's fault. He's a stud. But it's interesting that Miami has been this pass-heavy this year. Now, the next trend sort of re-emphasizes the point that I just made with the previous trend. But there's a lot of talk on social media every week about Tua Tagovailoa and his aggressiveness down the field. So let me throw some data at you. Among quarterbacks with 100 or more attempts, Tua ranks 37th of 40 in 15-plus air yard throw rate. So he's throwing at 15 or more air yards at the 4th lowest rate in football, ahead of only Mike White, Matt Ryan, and Cam Newton. Here's where things get interesting, though. If you look at completion rate on those passes, only Kyler Murray and Justin Herbert have had a higher completion rate on those throws. So yes, he's throwing the ball down the field at a low rate, but he's completing those throws at a high rate. That's at least somewhat of a good sign. Amari Cooper finishes the wide receiver 9 against Washington in Week 16. But let's break this down for a second. Cooper saw 11 targets in that game. That's just the 3rd time this year that he's seen more than 8 targets in a game. He also hit 70 receiving yards just for the 3rd time. His wide receiver 9 finish is also just the 3rd time that he's finished in the top 20 this season. For some perspective, 33 wide receivers have had more top 20 performances than Amari Cooper this year. Some of those receivers include KJ Osborne, Russell Gage, Kendrick Bourne, Darnell Mooney, and Terry McLaurin. It's been a rough season for Cooper. Hopefully he can finish strong this week. This Rashad Penny stretch has been awesome to see. He's now rushed for 135 or more yards in 2 of his last 3 games, and after seeing a not-so-great script in Week 15, he bounced back in Week 16 with an 81% running back rush share. He's now seen running back rush shares of 64%, 58%, and 81% over these 3 games. The receiving work isn't totally there with just a 5% target share during this time frame, but in a plus matchup this week against Detroit, Penny's in a good spot once again. Across the first 8 games of the season in PPR formats, Najee Harris gave us 6 top 10 performances and 7 top 12 performances. So he gave us 7 RB1 performances over his first 8 games. Over his last 7, he's had just 1 top 10 performance and 2 top 12 performances. And it really comes down to touchdowns. He scored a touchdown in 6 of his 8 games during that front half stretch. And in the game where he didn't score, it was that contest where he had 19 targets against the Bengals. He's found the end zone in just 2 games over his last 7. Now, considering the offense that he's in, it's not surprising that he wasn't able to maintain his early season pace. The good news is that his peripherals are still really, really good. Over his last 7, he's averaged a running back rush share of 85% per game and a target share per game of 13.7%. That's not as good as the first 8 games this year, but it's still elite. Since week 8, the Houston Texans have given up just 1 top 10 quarterback performance. So that's 7 games and just 1 top 10 performance. Now, I sent a tweet out the other day making fun of myself where I said, quote, "I told you to draft Trey Lance because of his week 17 matchup against the Texans." And I got responses from people saying like, yeah, great matchup for Justin Herbert this past week. And others pointing out that the Texans have been good against quarterbacks over the second half of the year. Well, in total this year, Houston ranks 13th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They're not like an ideal matchup, partially because of game script, but they're not some matchup to avoid. And keep in mind who the Texans have faced during this stretch of 7 games. Jacoby Brissett, Ryan Tannehill, Zach Wilson, Carson Wentz, Russell Wilson, Trevor Lawrence, and Justin Herbert. Of those 7 quarterbacks, the 2 who finished as QB1s were Wilson and Herbert. Those are the 2 best quarterbacks on that list. Basically, what I'm saying here is the matchup is not necessarily scary. It's a pretty average to above average matchup overall. Trend 8 is about Russell Wilson. I really hope we see the old Russ once again next year. I'm hoping that injury is why things have been a little bit rough. But what's more alarming is his rushing. In 2020, Wilson averaged 32 rushing yards per game. The year before that, it was 21. The year before that, about 24. And the year before that, almost 37. You get the idea. This year, Wilson's averaging 12.8 rushing yards per game. It'll be interesting to see if that's a talking point at all this offseason with Wilson, because Wilson will undoubtedly be a big talking point. Cordero Patterson is fortunate to have found the end zone twice over the last few games, because things have not been very good. He's rushed for a grand total of 32 yards over his last 2 on 18 carries. And his running back rush share has dropped over his last 3. He was hovering the 64 to 68% range in weeks 12 and 13, and then from weeks 14 through 16, that's dropped to about 54%. I think he's still fine to throw in your fantasy lineup, but he's not the must start that he was earlier in the season. The final trend this week, and actually the final trend of the year, is about quarterback scoring. Quarterback scoring was up big time in 2020, and I talked about that on this show during the offseason. That regression was inevitable, just given some of the reasons behind why quarterbacks might have been scoring more fantasy points. Last year, top 6 quarterbacks in points per game averaged 23.8 points per contest. And that only includes players who played 8 or more games. This year, top 6 quarterbacks are averaging 22.1 points per game, so almost 2 points lower. If you look at top 12 quarterbacks, it's the same story. Last year, the points per game average among that group, 22.2. This year, 20.8. Now, scoring is down, but scoring is down for everyone. So good quarterbacks are still giving you somewhat of an edge. But overall, scoring is definitely lower than in 2020. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've got subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll catch you tomorrow with the Weekly Sleeper Show.